So now we're talking about the immune system. So the immune system, its main function is protection, right? Protection from any kind of foreign invaders. The immune system is actually divided into two specific categories. You have your innate, which is your first line and your second line of defense, and then you have your adaptive. Okay, so the comparison between the two is, for example, the innate is more primitive, adaptive is more advanced. The innate is more fast acting, the adaptive takes a much longer time. The innate is non-specific, whereas the adaptive is more specific, right? And so if we were able to categorize the innate versus the adaptive and show a more of a comparison, the innate system is characterized by, for example, what would be an example of an innate immunity? So the classic example is skin, right? So your skin is an example. So any kind of barrier, so surface barrier to be precise. So any kind of surface barrier would be a perfect example. The skin, any kind of mucous membrane, so mucous membrane. What else would be a great example of surface barrier? Any kinds of oils, any kinds of, for example, stomach acid, so stomach acid. So the hydrochloric acid present in your body, your gut microbiomes, right? Everything, right? So any kind of barrier that's covering the surface is part of your innate immune system. And this is part of the first line of defense. The second line of defense is more of the inflammatory responses and also the other immune cells that are part of your innate immune system. So this is referred to as a primary. Then you have the secondary response. For example, these are any kind of inflammations, so your body begins. So one example is when you get a fever is due to the infections, right? So any kind of pathological conditions, like any kind of pathogens coming into your body, you have this inflammation generated, right? So your body temperature goes up because you have this excessive inflammation in order to entrap a lot of these pathogens and preventing them from infecting different parts of the body. Other cell types that are very important, so macrophages, so if you remember macrophages and natural killers, these are phagocytic cells that take a big role in engulfing any kind of pathogens and either destroying them or taking them to the adaptive immune system for some kind of secondary response, right? Any kind of antimicrobial proteins, so antimicrobial proteins, mucous membranes, right? So anything that's allowing for this problem. This is all part of your innate immune system. Adaptive immune system is different. So adaptive immune system is broken down into two separate categories. You have your humoral, right? So your humoral is more involving your B cells, so your B lymphocytes. And so if you remember from before, what do B cells' main function? So the main function of B cells is the generation of antibodies, right? So antibody production, and it's responsible for all of the secondary responses. So if you get some kind of virus that infects your body and then eventually the pathogen is destroyed, the humoral response activates the B cells to generate these antibodies. So that specific strain of pathogen, whether it's a bacteria, virus, protozoa, parasite, etc., will never infect the body again. So the body will be prepared for it. You have your humoral, and then finally you have your cell-mediated. So your cell-mediated response. So cell-mediated response involves all of your T cells, right? So T cells, you have the different kinds. You have your helper T cells, you have your cytotoxic T cells, you have your regulatory T cells. These specific T cells, for example, play a big role of direct contact, right? So humoral immunity is referred to as more of an indirect, right? So they wait for the antibodies to bind to trigger other cells of the body, other cells of the immune system to react. Whereas the cell-mediated involves, for example, like the cytotoxic T cells that we talked about. Cytotoxic T cells, these are basically the soldiers of your immune system, right? So they go out and actually fight. You have helper T cells, for example, these helper T cells, which allow for the activity of the humoral and your cell-mediated response to take place, right? So your helper T cells, right? You also have your regulatory T cells. Regulatory T cells are responsible for if your immune system becomes hyperactive, right? The regulatory T cells are sort of an immunosuppressive role, play a big immunosuppressive role. And so a lot of patients that experience certain kinds of autoimmune diseases have either an inactive or deficiency of these regulatory T cells.